All right, so here we are in our discussion on worldview. Now, this should be the very beginning of this particular course, right? Honestly, too, it's one of the most interesting and most fun topics, actually, that we can talk about because, one, it's very practical, right? Which it seems that most of our society is concerned with. Um, we could even say that that's probably the direct result of one particular worldview in particular called pragmatism. We're not going to worry about that right now. Obviously, we haven't even got 30 seconds into the course. Um, so one, it's practical to discuss worldviews, but also this is an issue of philosophical principle, heavy philosophical abstract thinking at its core, because what we're doing is we're analyzing, hence the name of the course, worldviews. Now, if you'll notice on this first slide here, before we even actually get started within the presentation, you'll see that the S is included in parentheses because there are worldviews. And so when we talk about worldviews with an S in the plural form, what we mean to say is that there are ways of looking at the world, right? Now, without the S, worldview, that's what we're going to initially begin this course with, what we're going to talk about here. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, before we talk about that, let's talk about worldview and why it's relevant. And we actually can go ahead and address what a worldview is. But again, why it's relevant is simply because this is going to be like all of our other courses in philosophy. If you've ever had another philosophy course, or if you've had a course with me in philosophy or a related subject, these courses, these types of studies, worldview, philosophy studies, they're similar in the sense that all of these are going to have an effect on topics that we find ourselves in discussion with daily. They're going to have an effect in disciplines that we have our irons in, so to speak. They're going to be relevant in almost every single thing that we do, if not every single thing that we do. Now, just again, in another philosophy course, we've talked about how the study of philosophy, the study of ideas, and the consequences of those particular ideas, they're pertinent to cinema, right? We've talked about in ethics, if you've taken an ethics course, we've talked about how almost every cinematic piece, every movie, every storyline involves elements of morality. And morality is something that we discuss in ethics, obviously. What is morality? What makes something right or wrong? Related concerns. Now, worldview is also going to have an impact on even cinema, even movies, even stories. You're going to follow a storyline based on the worldview that's portrayed there, the way that problems may seem to the solution rather to problems, how they're going to be offered up, is going to be related to the worldview of the author or the character in the story. Same thing goes with television, obviously. Just another format of that particular type of media. It's going to be related in legislation. What is right and wrong? What should we outlaw? What should we not outlaw? Right? What should we tolerate? What should we not tolerate? What should we tolerate up to an extent with punishment, then tolerate without punishment in any sense of the word. Again, ethics, epistemology, that which is just a branch of how do we know what we know. Your worldview will have will play a large role in how you believe that we know what we know, if we can know anything at all, right? It's going to have or play a key role in government. What type of government? How should government rule or govern its people? Should there be a government? Who should be in charge of that government? Should it be the people, something like a democracy, constitutional republic, or should it be just one particular person or one particular group, like an oligarchy? again, your worldview is going to determine what you view, how you view sexuality. At the time of this particular course and this particular recording, we've got cultural hot button topics that are very hot, hence the name, in our culture, such as gender. Um, how do we determine gender? Is gender determined biologically? Is it determined based on some sort of social construct? Your worldview is going to play into how you're going to answer these questions. Big questions. We're not discussing whether or not you need toast with your eggs in the morning. These are the questions by which we frame not only our lives, by societies, by our civilizations, by cultures. By your worldview is going to give an account of how you see marriage played out, whether it's a worthy institution, whether it's an institution at all, whether it's something that is decided upon by the government, or whether it's something the government recognizes, right? Your worldview is going to play into that. Obviously, anthropology, your worldview is going to guide how you see mankind, right? How you see humanity. What does it mean to be a human? Now, obviously, all of these are philosophical questions, philosophical topics that can be discussed in philosophical circles. But your worldview is going to determine how you answer so many of these questions. In fact, that's something that we could, if we had the time, that we could look at in much more depth. Just the fact that you may have courses in a philosophy class, or you may be majoring in philosophy, and you may have a course in epistemology, right? You may have an entire course in ethics. You may have a course in philosophy of law, right? Politics. And you think that you're just having the course in that particular subject, and you're looking at that particular subject in light of just that subject. But in reality, your instructor, the students that you're with, me included, our worldview is going to determine or guide, I should say, rather, is going to heavily influence, if not determine, the way in which we approach even those particular topics. So you begin to see just how incredibly important it is to, one, identify worldviews, to know what a worldview is, which we've yet to get to. You've probably figured it out. You're probably a pretty intelligent individual, or individuals if you're watching this as a group. But you're going to see how a worldview will dictate or influence, guide, and even possibly determine how you answer and look at each of those particular topics. Now, at the outset, we could sum up almost all of those particular genres that we've just mentioned so far of genres of life, so to speak: cinema, television, entertainment, legislation, ethics, epistemology, governments, all these sorts of things. We could sum those up with these words here on your PowerPoint: meaning, purpose, value, art, beauty. Some thinkers have said it something like this, like origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. I believe a thinker named Roger Zacharias says it something like that, something like origin, meaning, morality, and then destiny, in that order. Obviously, that's a logical type order, right? So virtually everything. Now, having said that, probably the longest introduction in history to what a worldview actually is. Let's look at worldview now. What is a worldview? So what is a worldview? Now, James Anderson says it this way: a worldview is an overall view of the world. It is not a physical view, but rather a philosophical view, an all-encompassing perspective on everything that matters to us or to the individual in question, right? Now, I've got a couple metaphors here, or possibly analogies, maybe, that try to get to the gist of what's being said here. So before we do that, let's look at it again. A worldview is an overall view of the world. It is not a physical view, but rather a philosophical view, an outlook, an all-encompassing perspective on everything that matters to us or to the individual in question. In other words, it is the metaphorical filter by which we see reality, right? And I have these in quotes if you're not looking at the screen right now. In other words, it is the metaphorical, quote, filter by which we, quote, see reality. Another analogy might be something like this. It might be said that a worldview is the metaphorical guidebook by which we interpret reality. It might be said that it is the template by which we construct a systematic structure to life's experience. And I kind of like that one. Let's say that again. It might be said that a worldview is something like a template by which we construct a systematic structure to all of our life's experience, how we make sense of what's happening in our lives, whatever it may be, what we experience, what we see, what we go through, things like that. Now, we've briefly mentioned this. We kind of touched on this a second ago. But again, God, the way you look at God, whether or not you think God exists, all of this, sexuality, marriage, anthropology, meaning, purpose, value, art, beauty, virtually everything is going to be impacted by our worldview, right? This is how we're going to make sense of what we're dealing with, what we're going through, what we're talking about, what we're thinking about, who we'll marry, who we won't marry, if we marry, all of these sorts of things. Now, we see that one's worldview will reveal just how one will approach and answer what are considered to be questions of ultimate significance. So what would those questions of ultimate significance be? Because remember, your worldview is going to seriously influence or push you towards how you answer these particular significant concepts of origins, meaning, value, purpose, end goal, and God, right? Now, and again, to put it in a way like, say, someone like Zacharias might say it, was these questions of ultimate significance. These questions or these topics here that cover more ground than anything else. He might say it like this: is, remember, origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Right? That's the way that some thinkers, specifically him, have put it like that. Now, again, if your worldview, like if you put on these glasses, right, and the way that you look at the world is going to be filtered by the lens of what glass you're looking through. If your worldview is whatever it specifically is, right, you're looking through that particular worldview, and it's influencing how you understand origins. Where did man come from, right? What is the point of mankind, right? Is there meaning? Is there morality? Is there purpose? And is there an end goal for mankind, right? Or is it just, whatever it will be, right? There is no end goal or purpose, something like that. Now, obviously, one stance in regard to such categories is pivotal, right? Now, I've got a rather lengthy quote here from one of my favorite authors of all time, a guy named G.K. Chesterton, writing in the 19th century. Well, really, late 1800s, really more of the 20th century, early 1900s, but in that same era. Now, he just has an unbelievable way with words, as far as literature goes, as far as putting things into perspective. Now, I'm going to read this at length because I think it's worth it. Here we go. And again, what I want you to hear is what he's saying here is the matter of a worldview is important. Someone's worldview is important. Now, hear this. But there are some people, nevertheless, and I'm one of them, who think that the most practical and important thing about a man is still his view of the universe. We think that for a landlady considering a lodger, it is important to know his income. But still more important is to know his philosophy. And so for our intents right now, we can say it's worldview. So what's more important is to know is what is his worldview, right? We think that for a general about to fight an enemy, it is important to know the enemy's numbers, but still more important to know the enemy's philosophy or worldview. We think the question is not whether the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether in the long run anything else affects them. In the 15th century, men cross-examined and tormented a man because he preached some immoral attitude. In the 19th century, we feted and flattered Oscar Wilde because he preached such an attitude and then broke his heart in penal servitude because he carried it out. Listen to that again if you need to. It may be a question of which the two methods was the most cruel or was the more cruel. There can be no kind of question which was the more ludicrous. The age of the Inquisition has not at least the disgrace of having produced a society which made an idol of the very same man for preaching the very same things which it made him a convict for practicing. Now, there's a lot that can be pulled out there, that can be abstracted, that can be cashed out if you go back through that. But essentially what Chesterton's saying for our point is, it's one thing to know these particulars about a person, but it's an entirely, and they may be useful, but it's an entirely different thing to know the worldview, right? This person's philosophy of life, so to speak. That is much more important. That tells you much more about the person than even the particulars do. Because let's say you do know the particulars. In this case here, let's say the woman that wants to rent a house out and the person that she's renting a house out to, let's say she knows his income. But if she knows his worldview, if she knows his philosophy of life, that would tell her more than likely what he's going to do with that income, right? So we see how worldview, your philosophy of life, that's going to tell how you answer and what you do with what you have and how you answer those fundamental questions. Now, so far we've been saying this in regard to the person, right? The worldview influences the person, what a person's worldview is, what is their philosophy of life, so on and so forth. Now, again, Anderson points out that this is not just true for individuals, right? Though it certainly is that. It is true for individuals. But it's also true for societies, right? What is the worldview of a particular society? What is the worldview? What is the predominant worldview of a culture under consideration? Now, that's not to say that every single person within the culture, within the society, is going to have exactly the same sort of view, right? No one is saying that, but there are tendencies of certain cultures, certain societies to share some of the nuts and bolts, the basic nuts and bolts of a particular worldview, right? Again, this is how we see cultures carry out a cultural belief, a cultural stance towards whatever it may be, right? Now, why is it important? Why should we even bother with analyzing worldviews, critiquing worldviews, thinking through them, identifying them, right? Why should we do this? Now, we could go into a long tirade about why you're in school to begin with, because you're here you're learning for learning's sake, right? You're not in a trade school. Not that trade schools are bad; they're not. They serve their purpose. But the point of a trade school is to learn the trade to get to the trade, right? It's not to learn for knowledge's sake, strictly speaking. But when you're studying liberal arts, right? When you're studying philosophy, when you're studying the humanities, when you're studying at what would be typically called a traditional type school, right? Typical college education. You're studying for studying's sake. You're learning for learning's sake, meaning that learning is not simply the ends, it's not simply the means to some other end, but it's an end in and of itself, right? To expand the mind, to grow in knowledge. Now, putting that aside, why evaluate, analyze, and critique worldviews? We've went through many of them, right, already, simply because they're going to have impact, right, across a variety, a spectrum of topics, ideas, genres, whatever else. So there's that, right? Go back through the first couple slides, few slides that we looked at. That's one of the reasons why. But this reason here again that you see on the slide is because, again, ideas, as has been said time and time again, ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. And when you know why people are acting a certain way, or if you know that you put certain people in power that hold a particular worldview and you've identified that worldview successfully, you have a much more, what's the word I'm looking for here? A much more reliable perception about what's going to happen, right? You're not going to be fooled when someone that holds a particular worldview acts a certain way or affects society in a certain way, whether it be extremely negative or whether it be extremely positive. And so, in fact, we see this playing out, right? I mean, this is how one of the reasons why we elect our officials, or would at least in theory want to elect our officials based on their worldview, right? What do they believe about X, right? And if they get into this position of influence or power or prestige or whatever it may be, then they're more likely to, or at least hopefully in theory, be able to put forth what they believe about position X, right? Because we realize intuitively that the worldview is going to influence their decisions, right? Now, that's one reason. And so we could even say it like this. That is to say, the logical implications of various worldviews, if lived out consistently, right, will impact individuals, cultures, societies, and even more. I'll say that again. One of the reasons that we talk about worldviews, analyze worldviews, identify worldviews, and discuss them, critique them, is here again, is because the logical implications of various worldviews, if lived out consistently, right, will impact individuals, cultures, societies, nations, and possibly more in some way, some shape, form, or fashion. Now, 2, we're also called to intelligently engage with people that disagree with us, right? And we want to do that in a winsome, attractive, and informed, that is to say, not ignorant fashion with those that have an opposing worldview than we would, right? We want to, we must intelligently and winsomely engage those that disagree with us, that have opposing worldviews. And so if we know, at least generally speaking, the frame of reference from which they're coming, right? Their worldview, their philosophy of life, their particular belief system, and where that may fit within the overall worldview structure there, then it helps us to winsomely, attractively, and intelligently engage with those types of people that may disagree with us, right? That's huge, right? I mean, just again, flip the role. Imagine someone trying to engage with you that has zero clue as to where you're coming from, zero clue as to your frame of reference, zero clue as to what you believe and why you believe that, and then expects you to abandon that and just embrace what they believe, right? I mean, think how persuasive and even possibly narcissistic that may be. So those are at least 2 reasons, aside from what we've discussed previously in the first couple few slides. Now, let's continue here with this. Look, if a worldview shapes, interprets, and provides structure to one's experiences in systematic fashion, then this systematic will be more or less consistent within itself, right? Now, what we're saying here, or what this is trying to say, what I'm trying to say here is just that whatever a particular person's worldview is, or culture's worldview is, society's worldview, it's going to be either consistent with itself, right? Or it's going to be inconsistent with itself, or it's going to be some measurable pattern in between that. In between those 2 extremes, either not consistent at all or completely consistent, or wishy-washy somewhere, maybe more or less consistent within itself. Now, I just want you to, the reason I'm saying that is because I just want you, as the slide says, I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind. Because later on, when we start to analyze or critique these worldviews, that's going to be very important. That's going to be one of the tools that we look at when we analyze and start to critique some of these worldviews, is how consistently can this be lived out, right? And how consistent is it just within its own framework, right? Within its own systematic, is it consistent, right? So to put that in very layman's, friendly terms, it'd be like saying you read a story, right? Imagine you're reading one of your children's storybooks, and it's just filled with contradictions, in the sense that, one day it says the character's doing this, and the next day it says the character wasn't doing that, but he was doing this, and then rather it's just completely nonsense. It's inconsistent. It just topples. And so that's going to be something I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we start to go through these worldviews at a little bit later time in the course. Not too much later, but later in the course. So let me just read that. Let me just read this last part of the slide, because that sums up this thought. This will be important later as we develop a philosophical methodology by which to evaluate various worldviews. So again, we're going to evaluate worldviews, and that's going to be part of it, this consistency, this consistent criteria. We'll say the criteria of consistency, inwards and outwards, meaning is it consistent within itself, right? Logically consistent, philosophically consistent. And outwards, can you consistently live it out, right? Existential viability, we might say in some philosophical circles. Now, this next slide here, move this down again. Some of the major themes in the frameworks, meaning, or in other words, what are these worldviews, right? Like, what are we going to be looking at? What are the themes? What are the frameworks? What are the systems of thought? Maybe we could say that, of these major worldviews. Some of them, you may be surprised, will hold various religions under one particular worldview. So it won't be just that, say, Christianity and, say, Islam are completely different worldviews, though there are very important distinctives. I'm not trying to shortchange that. But for the most part, they would be under the more general category, the general worldview of theism, right? And theism, just for some of you that may need to be refreshed, remember, theism is just simply the belief that there is a God, right? External, transcendent to the world, but that's active within the world, right? That has not left the creation, so to speak, as the watchmaker makes a watch and tosses it off to do its own thing, right? But that there's a transcendent other than God, but he's also involved within his creation. That's theism, right? So there are several, right, worldviews, and even those could be subdivided and nuanced even more specifically. Again, for instance, under theism, therein would fall Christianity, Judaism, Islam, things of that nature. And even that, really, you could even blow that out further. You could say something like a supernaturalistic worldview, right, which would include not only Christianity, Islam, Judaism, but it would include anything that even those adherents of those belief systems would think are silly, like maybe that ghosts exist and whatnot, something like that. The point just simply being that there are major frameworks, there are major worldviews, but they can be nuanced. But generally speaking, they can most of them fit in some particular category, and that's good. That's a good thing, because we can see them, identify them more easily, and be that much more able to evaluate them. Right now, what are they? Right. So we've recognized that they are, right. So what are they? Now, we'll just start with the slide. What are the major worldviews and or philosophical frameworks? So you've got agnosticism, and I'm just kind of lumping these together for simplicity's sake right now. You can see my disclaimer here at the bottom, where I say these are not synonymous and they'll be distinguished, right? But just for simplicity's sake and for right now, I'm kind of lumping some of these together. You've got agnosticism, right, and skepticism, meaning that, let's take agnosticism first. You may have someone that's an intellectual agnostic, right? Someone like a Christian thinker, Norman Geisler likes to say intellectual agnostic, meaning that you just can't know anything in regards to knowledge. And then you've got something like a theological type agnostic that would say, no, you can have knowledge about things of the world, but in regards to God, we just don't know anything like that, right? And you can't even know anything like that. It'd be a harder version of that. Then you've got skepticism that would be obviously similar to that. You've got theism, you've got deism, right? So theism, you can go back a couple minutes if you want to refresh on that, but deism would be roughly similar to deism, roughly similar to theism, in that there's a belief in God, a creator type God, but that he's not involved with his creation, right? That it was like the clockmaker that makes the clock, leaves it to do its own thing, right? Now, another major worldview, right? Another philosophical framework, right? That some people hold that dictates their or seriously influences their choices and how they're going to look at things, as do all the others, would be atheism, right? Now, even within atheism, and I'm going to use these terms, even though they're not strictly speaking the same thing, I'm going to use these terms for the most part synonymously. And that would be that naturalism and materialism and physicalism, I'm kind of using these synonymously with atheism for this particular course. Now, again, strictly speaking, you could be, you might not be a materialist, meaning that you might not hold that only the material world exists or all that is real is simply material. You may believe that there is no God, right, in the sense of like the theistic conception or deistic conception of God. For instance, you may be a Buddhist of some sort, but not be a materialist, right? Meaning that you think that there's some non-material reality, but you are an atheist. Again, in our culture, that's pretty rare. Usually, and again, I'm distinguishing these, but again, most of the time, most atheists, those that we'd be most familiar with, are materialists, meaning that they would say that the only thing that really exists is matter, right? Material stuff, right? Atoms, those sorts of things. That everything in some sense is composed with matter. There is no soul, there is no spiritual, this, that, or the other, there is no God, right? All of those things. Physicalism, again, roughly for our purposes, using that synonymously with that all that exists is the physical, right? Same thing with naturalism, even though we could go into more detail and distinguish that a little further. For our purposes, we're using that synonymously. So you've got the worldview, the philosophical framework of atheism, right, that people put on, look at life's experiences and interpret those through the film or through the lens, rather, of atheism, right, or materialism. Now we've got pantheism, right? So pantheism, generally speaking, is the belief that there's not a theistic or deistic type of God, but it's not atheistic either. It's, again, this is the system, this is the outlook that everything is God in some sense. That I'm God, you're God, that's God, this over here is God, and you're God, and the computer's God, and everything that is some sort of representation, right, or manifestation of God in some sense. There's this disjunct between things that exist is basically an illusion, and all of reality is ultimately one in some sense, which would be right here just really this metaphysical monism, that really just reality, all of reality is one. In the most literal sense possible, it's all one. And so any distinctions or any differences that we think that we see in reality, me, you, the computer, whatever else, that's illusory, right? And this metaphysical monism is not necessarily Eastern, right? I mean, a lot of people would think that this would just simply go back to Asia, but it really doesn't. I mean, this metaphysical monism, this type of pantheism, has roots in even Western civilization, the ancient Greeks. Those like Parmenides or even Zeno, one of his followers, would possibly argue for something like this sort of reality all being one. Now, we've got modernism and postmodernism, right? Now, these were born out of the Enlightenment era. These aren't old school in the sense that they can trace their roots as far back as some of these others, at least in the sense that we're making reference to them now. Not to say that the ideas and some of the ideas that infiltrate them that they're built on can't be traced back further. They could, but for our sense, these are relatively new. So modernism is born out of the Enlightenment era of philosophy, right? And modernism would say something like that empirical data is what gives us true knowledge, true fact, truth. And anything over and beyond just raw empirical data, what we can taste, see, touch, all these sorts of things, is just not reliable. And at best, not reliable, and at worst, it's none of that. There can't be any truth in that at all, right? So it would deny things like nature's essences, among other things, right? Or at least the knowability of such things, right? Now, postmodernism is a reaction to modernism, and almost as a way of trying to escape the difficulties or the objections of the critiques that modernism had raised against such things. Postmodernism just simply says that there is no truth with a capital T, right? That's true for all people at all places, at all times, in all instances, right? It would just say something like that truth just is a construct of the society, right, in which you live, right? A construct of that particular culture. Or you've got a kind of a postmodern pragmatism that truth is what works in some sense, right? Even that can be distinguished between pragmatism as a theory of truth and even sort of a postmodern type pragmatism like Rorty, a contemporary philosopher like Richard Rorty would argue. So you see how this can get crazy, right? And so again, if that part was confusing, I just want you to remember that we're just basically going to go through the general categories of worldview, like agnosticism, right? Theism, and deism possibly, atheism, pantheism, modernism and postmodernism. And we're not going to get into the uber specific nuance of each. Otherwise, I'm not even sure you'll get anything out of the course, right? Now, you'll notice that there's this last category on here that I've put, right? And clearly that's in jest, but as you know, has been said multiple times, there's truth behind every joke, right? The old adage. And so the truth behind that is the eclectic goofball category, as I've decided to call that. Meaning that, and think back to what we said earlier about being more or less consistent with a particular worldview, is you've got the eclectic goofball, right, who's going through these worldviews like he's at a buffet. Right, he's pulling from this, he's pulling from that, and when he's actually challenged, when he's actually held to the fire, so to speak, about what he's making, about the claims he's making, it can really, it's pretty easy to see that he's not being consistent at all. This guy has just gathered from each one of these what he likes, what he wants to be true, as opposed to what he's convinced he thinks is true, or maybe he's convinced that that what he's saying is true. No one's ever challenged him on it, and so his inconsistency is revealed in the discussion. So this is our eclectic goofball, right? This is our guy who is just picking and choosing throughout all these categories, and they don't even seem to make any sense at the end of the day. Now, if possible, we want to show someone like that they are radically inconsistent, right? That's at least a step in the right direction. Now, excuse me. got whammed by a yawn. So we'll go through those two, right? Now, how does one go about? Because remember, if our task is to look at worldviews, to talk about them, to analyze them, um, how do we do this, right? Um, how does one go about evaluating a worldview? Um, Even if we've identified them, how do we go about evaluating a worldview? First question. So, second would be how does one go about choosing, right? And choosing in the sense that either picking or negating, right? Affirming or denying a worldview. How does one go about choosing or abandoning a particular worldview? Um, Obviously, we're going to see that that's related to how you evaluate a worldview. And then lastly, why should I even do this, right? Or why ought one evaluate or choose a worldview? We could speak to that in the pragmatic sense. We could speak to that in the truth for truth's sake sense. But I want to leave you just hanging with those three questions at the moment. I want to leave you hanging with that, with those three questions of how do we even go about evaluating this stuff? How do we go about choosing it? And then why should we evaluate and or choose a worldview? Hopefully that will generate some thought in your own mind, and you'll be interested in trying to come to some particular conclusion on that. Now, that will at least end this particular session here with our discussion on worldview. Hopefully, you'll have some good stuff to think about, and you will be ready to come back next session